be a part of the record. Chairman Miller.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Good afternoon. In January, the Integrity Committee of the President's Council on Integrity and Efficiency completed its investigation of allegations of misconduct by Robert Moose Cobb, the Inspector General of NASA. After a 6-month investigation, the PCIE found that Mr. Cobb had abused his authority and exhibited the lack of independence, or the appearance of had exhibited the appearance of a lack of independence from NASA management. Those are violations of the quality standards for federal offices of Inspector General established under an executive order. The Integrity Committee said that discipline up to and including removal was appropriate. After receiving the report, the majority leadership of the Senate Subcommittee on Space, Aeronautics, and Related Sciences, Senator Nelson, as well as the chairman of the House Committee on Science and Technology, Mr. Gordon, and I, all called upon the President to remove Mr. Cobb as Inspector General of NASA. Mr. Cobb remains in office. The findings of abuse of authority by the PCIE involve Mr. Cobb's abusive and degrading treatment of his staff, resulting in massive staff turnover and affecting productivity. Mr. Cobb referred to his professional staff as burons, Mr. Cobb's shorthand for bureaucratic morons, and by other vulgar terms that I will not repeat here. Rather than dwell on the abusive atmosphere created by Mr. Cobb and its effect on productivity, I want to make sure that the second finding regarding the appearance of a lack of independence receives the attention that it requires. According to the official standards, Inspectors General and their staff, and I quote, have a responsibility to maintain independence so that opinions, conclusions, and recommendations will be impartial and will be viewed as impartial by knowledgeable third parties. Mr. Cobb has utterly failed to do that. Perception that Mr. Cobb lacked independence was set in motion during Mr. Cobb's hiring. Shortly after Sean O'Keefe moved from the Office of Management and Budget to NASA, Mr. O'Keefe, NASA's former administrator, decided that he didn't like the previous NASA Inspector General. He went to the White House and demanded a new one. Mr. Cobb was selected entirely clear, but what is clear is that Mr. O'Keefe personally chose his new Inspector General and established a regime in which Mr. Cobb was part of Mr. O'Keefe's team and not the independent Inspector General required by law. As Mr. Cobb described it, Mr. O'Keefe reached a conclusion that I would be the perfect person to conduct the independent office of Inspector General activities. Once at NASA, Mr. Cobb called Mr. O'Keefe his boss and said he was afraid he would be fired if he displeased Mr. O'Keefe. And why shouldn't he think that, since Mr. O'Keefe had been able to fire the previous NASA Inspector General and pick the new one? According to some interviewed by the HUD IG staff who carried out the PCIE investigation, Mr. Cobb was warned from the beginning about lacking an appearance of independence. But he ignored those warnings, and the Integrity Committee's record of investigation is full of evidence of his failure to maintain any shred of an appearance of independence. Mr. Cobb asked NASA officials how to design the IG projects. A December 12, 2002 email, for instance, asked NASA officials to discuss 2 proposed projects so we can take your views into account in designing our activities. After the Columbia accident, there are questions about the independence of the O'Keefe-appointed Accident Investigation Board. Chairman Gordon was one of those asking questions. Mr. Cobb provided an unsolicited personal letter to Congress, unsolicited by Congress at least, saying that based on his observations, the board was independent. But before sending the letter to Congress, Mr. Cobb sent a draft to Mr. O'Keefe for his review and comment. Mr. O'Keefe liked the letter a lot. I could go on and on with more examples of the ways in which Mr. Cobb tried to make himself useful to his friends at the top of the agency, especially Mr. O'Keefe. But what is most important here is that Mr. Cobb is now totally ineffective in his job and trusted by no one. As he has made clear in his testimony today, his written testimony submitted in advance, Mr. Cobb has learned nothing from the PCIE investigation. He admits no wrong. He blames others for all of his problems. Mr. Cobb said in his deposition that if the current NASA administrator, Mike Griffin, invited him to go play golf, he would love to go. By all means, I'm going to go play if he asks. If he wants to invite me out to dinner, I think it would be perfectly appropriate for me to do so. He wants the same kind of relationship that he had with Mr. O'Keefe. Mr. Griffin, to his credit, apparently does not. Mr. Cobb, you must leave. You have two clients, NASA and Congress. That is clear from the statute, from the Inspector General Act of 1978. That is clear from the quality standards for federal offices of Inspector General, which I hope every Inspector General would keep on their desk. Congress is your client, one of only two. It is apparent that Congress does not trust you. The committees of the House and the Senate that are responsible for oversight of NASA are sitting before you. All of us have called upon the President to fire you. You have told our staff that you are afraid to talk to your own staff because they twist your words. So you are hiding from your own staff. As one of our witnesses said in written testimony, each IG must be willing to accept responsibility for his or her behavior and acknowledge when their independence has been compromised fairly or unfairly and exit office gracefully. Mr. Cobb, the work of the NASA IG is important. Mr. Cobb, you must leave to preserve what is left of the integrity of your office.
Senator Hutchins.